Welcome back to the channel, everyone. My name is Joe Buskins. This is our family's boat shop. This is part 2 of our hardtop mold build. Now we're going to be building a custom hardtop for our 29, but I'm going to show you folks at home the whole process. So not just building the actual part, but actually building what we call the plug, which is the form for the mold. Then we're going to build the mold, then build the part out of that. And we've already got one episode out. Hopefully you've already seen that. But in that episode, we formed up the base of what we call our plug. And this is all made out of just kind of like furniture grade plywood and household grade lumber. It doesn't have to be anything super marine grade, because this isn't actually going to be on the boat. This is just a form or a shape. And you can see we've cut out our profile and everything is screwed down. But I wanted to show you folks at home some of the stuff we've been using, like a long board to shape this thing. If you don't have one, that comes from 3M. You can just stick the sticky backs on there. And if you'll notice here, there's a pretty curve to this panel. And these long boards like this will take that curve. And a lot of times, after we've done the rough cut, we're gonna make a series of nice passes just to true that up. You can also use the shorter ones. That's the little 3M that y'all have seen me use before. And going around these corners and just kind of tying everything together. Nice long movements. Take your time with this. This is going to be the foundation, and it needs to be really straight and really true and in good shape. But we're going to be bonding that piece of foam onto this plywood. And what we want to do, and we've talked about this a lot even in our how to fiberglass over plywood videos, surface prep is really, really important with getting good adhesion when you're using polyester resins and you're going on plywood. And one of the biggest things is putting some tooth or texture and making sure that you're roughing up that surface a bit. So what I would recommend is going over this surface in a nice uniform overlapping passes. We're going to go side to side, and then forward and back. Now obviously when you're doing this at home, you'd want to wear some PPE, some glasses, a good dust mask, or have some fans moving air. Now I have, for the sake of time, already done all this prep. So I've already sanded all this surface. I've already gone around with the long board and that curved fairing board and shaped these edges and got them the way I want. And we've also, for the sake of time, because I know your time is valuable, folks, we want to kind of speed this along as much as possible. We took our 4x8 sheet of foam and we laid it over the top of our plywood base, and we used a whole series of bricks. Now, you may not think of bricks as being something useful in a boat shop, but a lot of times when we're trying to get foam or core to stick down or bed into something, it is hard to beat just your good old standard bricks like you can pick up at your local builder supply. But we laid the foam over the plywood and came up underneath it with a standard, like a Sharpie or a marker. That's a Milwaukee brand. Actually, I got that one at Home Depot. And just put a nice clear mark from the bottom all the way around the perimeter. And we've already flipped this thing over on the table, and I'm using what we call a jigsaw or a saber saw, and I've put a little bit of angle on that table, and that is about 22 degrees of angle there. So we're going to be kind of undercutting this a little bit. The sides, I think we're going to do it about a 22 degree angle, and the front I'm going to do it a steeper angle, more like a 45, with a real pretty radius or bull nose on those edges. And it's what we're going to do. This is super important to remember though, is we're cutting outside of the line, outside of the mark, because that'll give us a little, what I call, wiggle room, so that when we stick it here on the plywood, we're just going to sand it down to where we want rather than trying to get it exact. One other tidbit that I didn't talk about or show is that when you're placing your jig or your form, whether it be on your shop floor or on a table like the one we have here in the shop, you want to be sure that the table or the surface you're working on isn't what I would call racked, meaning that there's a different degree or angle on one side versus the other. And it can look perfectly flat, but if you build your form on there and there's some twist or rack on the table or the floor, the part you build will not be straight and true. And what we did is you can actually even use these 2x4s as a sight line. And when you're looking from this forwardmost one all the way to the back one, you want them to line up. You don't want one at a different angle than the other. As a matter of fact, you can see, I don't know if the variable is in my table or if there's a low spot in the shop floor, but it took about 1/4 of an inch on that one side. That corner was a little bit low and you could physically see it with your eye. And it's very, very important to get your part true and level on the floor before you start, because you're gonna have a crooked part if you don't do that. So we're fixing to jump on over here, and I find a lot of times using a vacuum is really handy. Now, a lot of times I have my son helping me here and he can hold the vac while we're cutting. But what we're gonna do is use our big table here. That's another thing you folks need. I'll tell you what, I might do an episode on just building workshop tables, because it sure does make your life easier. But we're just gonna be using the jig, and I'm gonna go ahead and nip this off a bit. You can see I'm leaving the line completely. It does not have to be perfect. It's okay for it to be a little bit long, again, because what we're going to be doing is putting several coats of resin on the plywood and several coats of resin on the foam, and we're going to be sticking them together and bonding them together and then holding those bricks on top of them, let that cure overnight, and then we can get ready to put some fiberglass over the whole assembly. So this is going to be a really cool episode. If I haven't said it lately, I want to thank everyone that's been following the channel, watching, tuning in. Remember, if you're enjoying the content, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to go ahead and finish cutting this part out. We'll catch you here in just a second. So check out, we have shaped up our foam core or sheet. You can see here on the front, now it's upside down, but the forward piece of the panel is going to be a 45-degree angle, and then we got a 20-degree, and it's kind of a rough cut at this point. Again, we're not trying to get it just exact, and that's okay. But we are nearing the end of the day, and we've got some weather approaching here in the next day or two, so I want to go ahead and seal up this wood and this foam and get it ready to bond together. Now, some of you folks have been following the channel may have seen some of our resin selection guide videos, may have seen the fiberglassing over plywood video. The resin selection is an interesting thing, though. There's different resins you could use for this application. I really like an ISO tooling. It's a polyester resin. ISO stands for isophthalic, and tooling is more like when you're building molds and plugs and parts. Matter of fact, our 29-footer was built out of isophthalic tooling resin. And this is from the folks, if you guys want to order some of that, that comes from Fiberglass Warehouse, and I'll be sure to put a link in the description down below in the video there for you folks. So what we're going to do, go ahead and we're going to pour up about a quart or so. Now folks, I have been doing this my entire life, and a lot of times we'll just kind of roll with it. My dad called it eyeballing it, but if you kind of want to know, or a refresher, if you're mixing up resin, say per quart, generally is a good rule of thumb, 10 to 12 cc's on average. I'm going to mix this a little bit on the hot side, and if you have never used these little graduated catalyst cups, they are very handy in getting an accurate measurement. Catalyst is going in, and again, this is going to be kind of a hot batch because it's a thin coat, and I want this resin to cure before we have any weather come and the humidity develops tonight, because I don't know if you folks can tell or not, but it has become warm weather down here. All of a sudden, we're approaching summertime here on the Gulf Coast, and the temps are high. Now you can see again, we're using a dyed catalyst. It's got some red color in there, and that really helps us to see when we've got a good thorough mix. And I like to kind of go around the edges and work it forward. Obviously some good eye protection, and a respirator is a good idea, but it is really hard to hear sometimes through the respirator. So now I'm doing this just to expedite things along. Sometimes we will just use a roller and dispense it that way, but for the sake of time, sometimes just getting it out of the pan and on the panel is a great way. I'm gonna go front to back and then side to side. And again, folks, we are in a good open air shop. We got a lot of airflow. I would highly recommend though wearing a good respirator when you're doing this. And all we're trying to do is just get a primer coat. And that is one of the fundamentals of getting polyester resins and even vinyl esters to stick really well to plywood. Is first we sanded this plywood, put some tooth on it. Then we made really sure that it's good and dry, and we blew the dust off of it. And then we're gonna prime this and let this dry overnight before the next coat. And that way you're saturating the wood, the resin is allowed to penetrate in there and get a good bond on the base material. And this is one of those things that a lot of people fall short on, is they do not sand the wood, they do not make sure it's good and dry, and then the priming of the wood before you apply any glass or bond anything to it. So we're going to put this primer on here. We're also going to be sure to get the edges real well. Attention to detail is important. This is time well spent, I promise you that. And you can see by pouring that out and using a roller. Folks, I see a lot of guys on YouTube using little bitty brushes, and they're trying to wet out fiberglass with a little bristle brush. And we use a brush for mixing resin and dabbing it in corners. Outside of that, a roller, this is real time. That did not take more than a minute or two to get that material on there. A roller can pick up puddles of resin and it can redistribute it. I'm going at a 45-degree angle now to be sure we've got good distribution. And you notice I'm not jumping all over the place when we're wetting this out. I'm doing a real systematic, almost like a search grid, if you will. We're going side to side, front to back, diagonal. And you do it this way, you're not going to miss any spots. You're going to get good resin distribution. You're going to get a quality part. And like I said, our family has been building boats since the 60s professionally, and we've built hundreds of them. And we always want to do a quality job, but there's no reason in dragging it out any longer than it has to be. And a little roller, this one's cut down to half size on a small frame. Kind of one of my favorite fiberglass tools for sure. All right. That looks pretty good. I'm not trying to just get huge amounts of puddling resin on there. We're basically trying to get just a good coat, and then tomorrow we're going to do another good coat. I'm going to clean some of that resin out of the pan before we start our next batch. I would say that was perfect, y'all. We kind of just winged that one. That was exactly the right amount of resin. That was just a guesstimate there. Now you could also use just a good standard, an ortho polyester laminating resin. But the important part here to notice on these resins, folks, is the laminating part. This isn't finishing resin, and this is not a DCPD, which is another type of resin that dries really hard and slick. We want this material to stay tacky so that when we add subsequent layers, it's going to get a good aggressive bond. So an orthopolyester laminating resin could work in this situation, or an upgrade from that one, again, would be the ISO tooling polyester resin. So another batch coming up, about the same as that last one. And again, I've mixed hundreds, well, probably thousands of batches, and you get pretty good at eyeballing it just because we've done it so much. But remember, in general, about 10 to 12 cc's per quart of polyester or even vinyl ester resin. Now, the hotter it is, the less catalyst you can get away with. Temperature is going to affect the cure rate. All of these resins are an exothermic resin, meaning they put off heat when they cure, and the hotter it is, the faster they cure. So again, should be wearing some safety glasses there. I'm going to jog any resin out of my brush. I'm kind of going around the corners, to the back, off to the side. All right, here we go. Now this foam might actually take a little more, it might take a little more resin than the wood did. It's going to be a little more porous. I may have to come back and add a little bit. We'll see. These paint tray liners are a good way to save your pans as well. We picked these up at our local Lowe's. Just the disposable paint trays is a good way to go. I'm going to try to get all that resin out of that brush. And we are just primer coating. All right, let's see. I think this foam is going to take more resin than the wood did. We'll see how far she goes. I do appreciate everybody tuning in and checking out the channel. The channel has really been growing lately. You guys really make me feel appreciated, man. I'm glad y'all are enjoying what we're doing. We do have our project boat, our Blazer. I know there's a lot of excitement about that, and we're going to get back on it, but our charter season is right around the bend, and this hardtop is something we've been talking about for a while. And I've had a lot of you folks express a lot of interest in learning how to build a mold or mold parts, and then a hardtop for like a center console is definitely within the range of doable. Like if you're ever contemplating building a boat, I would start with something like a hardtop first. It's not a tiny part, but it's big enough that you can kind of get a feel for what you're going to encounter if you're trying to actually build a boat hull or mold. A lot of folks are learning about fiberglass for the first time through the channel, and there's nothing wrong with starting small and working your way up to the bigger parts. That's what I did, folks. When I was a boy, I built some small skiffs and smaller boats, and we worked our way up to something like the 29 there in the background, which you guys and gals watching out there, there's over 20, I think we have 25 videos documenting the build of the 29, and you could learn an awful lot about the boat building and fiberglass process in those episodes there. Yep, this foam is taking a little more resin than the wood, the plywood. That was pretty close. Pretty close. Almost. I might could squeeze out enough out of the... I think I'm going to go ahead, instead of it being super dry, I was getting a little bit more out of the roller there, but we're just going to make another tiny batch. And it's amazing what you can do when you learn how to work with fiberglass, get comfortable with the different resins. The different fiberglass cloths and different resins are kind of like different lumbers you may encounter when you're going to build things. And they're not all the same. There's definitely an application for some more than others. Now, a lot of folks are curious what their boat is built out of. They're worried about compatibility with epoxy or vinyl esters and wanting to know what to use. I can tell you with quite a bit of certainty, probably 98% of the boats out there, maybe 97%, are built out of a polyester laminating resin like we're using right now. That's a very common resin for building boats. It's very rare for a boat to be built out of epoxy, and it's pretty rare for a boat to be built completely out of vinyl ester. And it's important to remember that generally polyesters and vinyl esters work real well together and are kind of interchangeable. But epoxy is a little bit of a different animal, and there can be compatibility issues with epoxy. Now, if y'all folks are wondering what kind of roller I'm using, that is just from Lowe's. That is a fairly inexpensive roller. We wrap them in tape before we use them to help pull off some of the loose hairs. And when we're just doing basic laminating work, we use a fairly inexpensive roller. And then what I do is I'll take them over there on our bandsaw and just cut them right in half. Yeah, good old shop bandsaw. Everybody needs one of those. Oh yeah. I'm excited to get this done. I'd love to know what kind of projects you guys would like for us to tackle. Obviously, again, we've got the big blazer project that we're working on, and we're gonna have this hardtop build. I had kind of floated the idea of maybe building a microskiff of some kind, maybe next winter, something in the 15 or 16 foot range. Seemed like that is a very popular thing these days. It's something economical to operate. All right, so it's the next morning, folks, and the resin that we put on yesterday has thoroughly dried. And we had some bad weather come through last night, and it still cured off really nice. And that's kind of one of the advantages of mixing it a little bit extra hot on the catalyst side when you're just doing a very thin coat. Now, what we did for the sake of time this morning, I went ahead and came in here, and there were a few little hairs and burrs on the surface, and I just used our little 3M hand sanding block and some 80 grit paper and went over the whole surface of everything to knock down those little burrs, and also on the plywood itself. Now, remember, if you're going to be fiberglassing over plywood, the sanding and then the priming phase and letting it cure is going to be a big part of getting a quality fiberglass job, especially over wood or plywood. But again, same deal. Went around this thoroughly, scuffed all these surfaces, knocked down all the little burrs, and we're getting ready to apply another coat. And this coat is actually going to be the glue that holds the core to the plywood support here. And what we're doing, a good thick coat on each side. We're going to let it tack off for a little while, and then we're going to place them together super carefully. But again, I mentioned it rained a bit last night and humidity is quite high, but I need to move forward with this project. It's not actively raining right now, but another one of those little tricks that you can do, just use a little small heat gun, and if there's any moisture on the surfaces, it is okay to come through and kind of lightly warm that surface up. Just remember to keep moving. These heat guns are incredibly hot. We're just trying to warm the surface and maybe cook off a little moisture. So that is a good little trick to keep in your book. And then what we're going to be doing today to show some differences. Yesterday, we coated everything with this ISO tooling, a polyester resin. But I want to show you folks that compatibility amongst different resins is something you can factor in. You may need 2 or 3 different resins in your shop for different projects. And so what we're using right now for the glue coat, we're just going to use the ortho polyester, and again, that is a laminating resin. So same as yesterday, if you folks remember, we went with about a quart. You can see we've got a slightly different color to this resin. Got about a quart or so, and again, we're going to mix it fairly hot, probably closer to that 2% range, which is on the upper end. Remember, when you're mixing catalyst, and that is a red dye, safety glasses are a good idea. That little metered mixing cup, we'll put a link in the description below for everything we're using. And you folks, if you're enjoying what we're doing here on the channel, just remember that if you guys need some of these supplies and you purchase through the links below in the videos, that does help support and encourage what we can do. Same as we did yesterday. We're just going to go ahead and we may even put a little more material on than we did yesterday, because again, this is going to be the glue. Now normally if we were gluing foam onto a core, I would probably put a layer of CSM or chop strand mat to glue them together. If you were doing like a transom core, foam core, you would definitely want to put some fiberglass between to help glue them. But in this application, all we're trying to do is stick this temporarily. This is going to be a temporary part just to build our mold off of. Again, this is what we call a plug. So there's no point in it being crazy overbuilt. It just needs to be enough material on there to stick the two panels together. With the cost of materials these days, you know what I mean, there's no sense in wasting material if it's not necessary. Now what'll happen on the wood on this coat is, because the plywood has been primed, it's not going to soak up near as much resin as the first coat did typically. All right, that is looking good. Just want to be sure not to miss any spots. Being good and thorough is very important. And you can remember, almost all your polyester and vinyl ester resins are compatible with one another. You can put epoxy over polyesters and vinyl esters, but we don't usually recommend putting anything polyester or vinyl ester over epoxy. And I know there are some folks that say otherwise, but people that do it professionally and work in the industry, and if you talk to the resin suppliers, just not recommended to put epoxy over, or polyester rather, over epoxy. But you can mix and match different resins. Now I don't typically blend them as a liquid, but there's a lot of times when we can go with one style and then another style after its initial cure. We'll go a little bit more. The foam seems to take a little more resin than the wood. Remember, again, about 2% or so. So in a quart, you're probably looking at 15 to maybe even 18 cc's for just a skin coat if you're going on the hot side. There's never a time when you would apply any kind of resin or gel coat without adding a catalyst or a hardener. Very, very important. It's a slightly different technique than what we have done in the past. Like when you're building a plug or a pattern, you can use plywood to build thickness. You could theoretically just build the part without building a mold, but it's a different, you still would need a jig or a form of some kind. It's a slightly different process. But a lot of the principles we're showing would apply to other jobs. So you folks that are just learning about fiberglass out there, it's important to remember that you can take a lot of what we're doing as long as you have the principles and the foundation. There's a lot of ways you can adapt it and apply it to your own style. Just the fundamentals are important. Good surface prep. Mixing your materials well. Just being really nice and thorough. You can work fast and you can still work neat. Yes. That looks good. That's a pretty sight from here looking over. Now sometimes we will even get down low and look across the panel. Sometimes that'll help you to kind of see if there are any dry spots. That was about perfect on the volume of resin we mixed there. Still got a little bit of resin in the roller here. I'm going to come back and maybe fill. Sometimes you can use the roller to fill some of those deeper screw heads. But remember, this is just a temporary part. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to give this just a little while to kind of tack off. Because if we try to glue these two pieces together while everything is really fresh, it's going to slip and slide all over the place. So the idea is we're going to let it tack a bit. It's almost going to be like contact cement. We're going to set this on. And then I got a whole series of bricks. Y'all probably wondering what we're going to do with this. I'm going to show you in just a second. Okay, so we've got the piece of foam core stuck down on the plywood core. Sorry I didn't get any footage of that. It took both me and my cameraman both to kind of flip that thing over. But I want to show you folks, prior to bedding this or sticking this down, I put some center marks right there. One little piece on the plywood, one piece on the foam core, and the same deal here on the back side, so that as we're lowering this down, we know that we're lined up. And so what we're going to do is just use a whole series of bricks. And we actually had set out a bunch of bricks when we did what I call a dry fit. We had put this up here on this panel. I knew exactly how many bricks it was going to take. And we use bricks all the time for doing like bedding core and sticking things down where you need to spread out. Sometimes you can even get bricks with little fragments broken out of them. If you go to your local building supply, sometimes they'll just give you ones where you got pieces of them. And I like to start in the middle of a panel like this and then work my way out to the edges. That way you get a good bond down the center line, and then we just nice and uniformly come back and work it out from the middle. That way you're less likely to trap any air bubbles. So I think you guys and gals get the gist of things. We're going to do kind of basically, we're putting a row everywhere where there's kind of about a third, a middle, a third, and then right on the edge. Usually that works pretty good. So we have weighted this thing down seriously, and it's been about an hour or so since we put all the bricks on there, and the resin here around the edge at this point is no longer super tacky or wet. It has about fully cured, but you can see we put a substantial amount of bricks on there to weight that down. Woo! All right, folks, we have gotten all the bricks moved off of there, and we're in the process of fairing or shaping. Now we're again just using a little 3M block, and we've got a tiny reveal or a lip. And if you remember when we made this piece, we cut it a little long, and it's because this foam is so soft. Sometimes you get some resin out on the edges that has to be faired. Sometimes there's some little irregularities. So it's better to cut that foam about 1/8 of an inch or so long. And then what we're doing is just real methodically, we've got a nice angle here, and I'm holding this block with light pressure, not an overly heavy hand, and we're moving around. So you don't want to just sand in one spot till it's perfect and then move to another. I have always found that something like this, it is better to bring the panel down uniformly. You're less likely to get little ripples and what my dad used to call whoop-de-woos. We want this thing really nice and fair and straight and true. And again, we got a little bit of a reveal to sand down there, but it's better it be a little bit extra than too short for sure. So first thing we're gonna do is get everything back to flush with the plywood. That's one reason we used a plywood base, is because it's much harder than the foam. We got the plywood right, and now we're gonna kind of sand the foam right down to it, and then we'll be radius in these edges. See, we got a little more rake on the front. Make it a little more aerodynamic looking, a slightly different profile. That's about a 45 degree, maybe even approaching 50 by the time we're all done. And then around 20 to 22 degrees here on the sides. Just notice we continue to move. Work your way around a little bit at a time. All right, check that out, folks. We've got that reveal sanded right down to nearly nothing. We've got it just about perfect. We got a little more rake here on the front. I think that's gonna aesthetically look really nice. And on the sides here, a little more upright. Same deal. We got in there really nice and tight, and you can see how that resin glued that foam right down to the plywood beautifully. Pretty happy with that. So we got another tool of the trade there, folks. That's called a bevel square. That's an adjustable tool that you can use for finding a bevel or an angle. And we use it a lot of times when you're making something like this. You can see that it fits nice and tight against that angle. And then as we come over here, we're seeing the exact same angle on this side. Now we went ahead and checked it. Now you can vary these angles on the side by a degree or 2 or 3, whatever works for you. And that's what's cool about these, is they're adjustable. But basically you find an angle you like on one side, and then you use this as you're sanding, and it helps you gauge as you move around. And that way you got a nice consistent angle or bevel all the way around. So just a little bevel square. They have those everywhere if you've never used one. And then again, we're finishing up with the 3M, the big flexi board there. And it's just a light touch. And a lot of times I will just go around and around this thing with just the lightest touch when you get close, and do the final detail. Now a lot of times I'll go around one direction, and then I'll reverse and come around the other direction, all the way around nice and uniform. You gotta be so careful with this lightweight foam, or you'll sand a hump or a groove into it. So you just wanna take your time. So now we're getting really, really close to moving on to putting a nice radius or kind of a bull nose on this corner. We're not gonna be having a super sharp edge like that, because on a hardtop like this, a lot of our clients, when they're casting, may not realize the hardtop's back there, come back and rack the rod against the hardtop. So the softer and easier the transitions are, the less likely it is to damage a rod. And that could be the case even with you guys. Even getting on and off the boat, you know, if you were to bump your head or to reach up there and grab it, it's just nice to have a nice radius corner. So what we're gonna do to get that is, instead of trying to sand a radius in just one area, what we're gonna do is we sand and we put what I call a facet in there. I believe if you look, you can see. So instead of trying to round a radius, we're just gonna sand this at exactly, I guess that would be perpendicular square to the corner. And we're gonna go around this nice and uniformly, and we're gonna try to get that even all the way around. Just a nice consistent corner. And once we've gone all the way around, we're gonna change the bevel of the board, and we're gonna kind of knock that upper corner down and knock the lower corner down. And it's amazing doing it that way versus just trying to sand a random radius in one spot and then moving up to another spot. It's much more consistent if you put a facet in it, go all the way around, get the facet, and the widths will change. Obviously, if you want a sharper corner, it'd be a narrower facet. If you want a softer corner, it'd be a wider facet. But again, the same deal. You can almost go around like we were doing earlier and just walk this thing around several times to get that facet. I'm going to go back the other way now. I tell you what, folks, you'll get your steps in doing this kind of stuff. That is for sure. All right, and a lot of times what we'll do is you make a few passes. I'm going to stop with the vacuum. We'll clear off the dust. We'll look at it. If we're pretty happy with it, we'll just continue. In a few moments, this thing should be ready for a primer coat of resin and then some fiberglass. All right, folks, so we have sanded this bevel, that first facet, and it worked out to just a little more than about 5/8 of an inch or so. You can see in relation to my finger there. Now, there's no particular rhyme or reason for that. I just feel like on this particular panel, that's gonna look good. And as you can see, we've come all the way around, and it's a little longer on this front face, which is okay. I wanted a little more sweep on the front of this, and as we come around, you've got it. It's nice and consistent. Then what we can do is we can come back with the block again, and we're starting the second facet. And so we're coming up on this sharp corner here, and we're just gonna start, we split it in half. So we got the corner coming to a point, and we're kind of riding right on the edge of that. I'm gonna make one full pass, and then another one back. So that's 2 passes, and you can see we've knocked that corner down. I'm gonna go around a couple times, and you can see how you can get a really nice consistent radius even if you don't have like a CNC machine and some crazy expensive tools. Just a block, and then do it methodically. Take your time, have a little patience. So look how nice this looks. We've got that top radius done for the most part. You can still see there's a sharp corner right there. So it's gonna be more of the same, folks. We're just gonna split that hard point right there, and I am just gonna walk this thing around this top several times. Just nice steady pressure, holding the angle exactly the same as I go around. Last time I did this, I counted, it was about 3 full passes, kind of took us to where we wanted our radius to be. Now that's 2. Now one thing that we'll do a lot of times too is just very carefully, once you've made your 3 full passes, is we're just gonna kind of roll over the corner just a little bit. And we'll finish with the block, and then once we finish with the block, a lot of times I'll take something even as fine as like 400 grit, and you're just kind of laying it over that edge, and I'm just gonna walk around it real carefully, get a final contour. Yeah, so it's just attention to details, but that already, look how pretty that radius is. That'll be easy on the hands, it'll look nice, and also when someone's casting, it's not gonna be likely to do damage to the rod. Folks, there's some resin going in the pot there for our primer coat. We've gotten almost all of our, well, we essentially have gotten all of our sanding done. Maybe my cameraman can walk around there and just show how pretty that profile has turned out. And again, we're gonna mix another hot coat of resin just as a primer to seal this. We're going back right now with ortho polyester, and again another primer coat here, folks. And this kind of shows again that your different polyesters and vinyl esters can be interchangeable, although I don't typically blend them in liquid form. Now I do want to try to minimize any hairs that might be in my roller, and you guys have seen me before where we use the trick where we wrap it, but there's another trick you can use. And I have found that's a really good way. You can see how it spins up those fibers, but it'll get a lot of those loose fibers out of the way. Good mix on this, and while this is curing, we're gonna be tearing our glass off of our roll. We're gonna do more of what we did earlier. We'll do the pour, save a little bit of time. Time is money. This foam really soaks up a pretty surprising amount of resin. I know I get a lot of questions about different types of foam. Again, this is just what they call fish box foam or ice box foam. It's like a 2 pound density, fairly lightweight stuff, but the lighter the density, the better it is for insulation. But there's not a lot of strength there. You're gonna be really relying on fiberglass if you want any real amount of strength. Coming right over those edges real nice and tying that. Using that plywood as the base has worked out really nice. Yeah, that looks beautiful. Really nice soft round corners on this part. Again, in the charter world, we have a lot of folks that just are not used to being on a boat, and when they go to cast, the rod ends up getting racked right against the hardtop. Hardtop gives us some nice shade. It's almost an absolute necessity, not really an option for our part of the world. And we also get hooked less. It gives it somewhere for me and my son. We can hide under the hardtop, and it's harder for people to accidentally hook us when they're making their back cast. So there's several benefits, and it's a very compact one. I love this style of hardtop. It really just gives you the shade you need right in the middle of the day. The sun is the most intense. You can make all kind of things out of this foam. Insulated fish boxes, again, are super common. It's great for form like this for building. A plug is what we call this part. So this is, again, the mold for the mold. In the boat world, we call it a plug. That looks pretty across there. I like that. You see I went lengthwise, and now I'm gonna go across. Wax on, wax off. Oh, that looks nice. Looking for any little dry spots on there. Running it down on this edge to the plywood really ties it together. So we're ready to do some glass work, folks. You can see here we've already got our layer of mat cut out. We used our nice cutting table over there on the other side of the shop, which if you watch the channel, you've seen us use that. And that is something, if you're gonna be doing a big project, a cutting table of some kind sure saves a lot of trouble. But we're just going with one layer of 1 ounce CSM just to seal this. Again, since this is just a pattern for the mold, it doesn't require a whole lot of fiberglass. But one of the tricks I wanted to show you folks is we've got our primer coat on there, and we've positioned this so that we've got the correct amount of overhang everywhere. And it can be tricky sometimes if you're trying to wet underneath it and then place a big piece of mat like this. So a lot of times what I like to do is place it, and then what you can do is just fold it back on itself half of the way. So what we're going to do is we're just going to fold it back halfway, and we're going to saturate this with some resin, and then you can fold it back on itself, and it won't pivot or torque or twist. And it's much easier to handle this way than if you try to wet it out first. Now again, I wanted to show you folks some variations. This is another product from Fiberglass Warehouse, and this is a DCPD Ortho blend. And a DCPD is not a resin we use an awful lot in our shop because a lot of our projects run on a long time. And one of the reasons we don't use a DCPD, and not that it's not great stuff, it's just, after a few days, it dries very hard. It's not tacky at all. It's not like a laminating resin. But there might be projects for you folks at home that this could be a really good solution. If you've got like some auto body work and something that you need to fiberglass, but then you need to sand it, and you don't want a tacky, sticky surface like we need in a boat shop for laminating more afterward, a DCPD is really good. It also has really good cosmetics. It's kind of low shrink and it's readily available. So we're going to be using some of that to saturate this mat, just to show you guys some variables and some options there. And it's the same as the other materials we're using. Generally, we're going in that 1 to 2% catalyzed or catalyzation. Again, a good idea to wear some safety goggles and a mask when you're doing this at home. And we're mixing a little bigger batch here because we're not just wetting out. We're not just doing a primer coat. We're actually wetting out some mat. This is pretty exciting. This is going to seal the foam, give us a nice solid surface to work off of, and then we'll be ready to actually start doing some fairing and shaping. And I'm going to show you folks at home some special primers and fillers that are made just for tooling work or mold building work. There's a lot of special products out there that can make the job go a lot easier. All right, we've already got our little roller prepped and ready. Kind of more of what we normally do. I'm just going to get some resin out there. Tyvek suit's not a bad idea either if you don't work with this kind of stuff all the time. The more you do it, the better you'll get at keeping it off of your clothes. But Tyvek suit certainly save you from ruining some of your clothes, and it keeps the glass fibers out of your clothes. When we're grinding or sanding, a lot of times I will use a Tyvek suit. Now we can just very carefully let this, and a lot of times I would have my helper there helping me. And now before I saturate this, I'm going to take this half and we just hold it back on itself, kind of up to the wet line, the first half. If we were to have went ahead and wet out this mat before we folded it back, you'd be folding your CSM or your mat back on wet material. And if you've ever tried to move or deal with CSM that has had resin saturated through it already, it is very, very challenging to move. It melts it basically. The resin is going to kind of melt. So I want to come right up to this edge but not beyond it. All right, folks. Now we'll just fold it back on itself. It is easier to do with two people, but there you go. Not too shabby. All right, now we can back up and start wetting. You can see it's already started to soak through the material on the bottom, and I'm gonna come around these edges. The corners and edges are always an area where we focus our attention first to help it bend around. The styrene will kind of melt the binders in the CSM. That's another thing we get a lot of questions about. You can technically use CSM or mat with epoxy, but it doesn't melt the binders like a polyester or a vinyl ester based resin does. So like when you go around a corner like this, if you use an epoxy with mat, it'll want to just kind of pucker up and basically not conform to the surface. So you can use it, it just doesn't work super great. Now some of you folks that are watching from overseas, there is a mat available with a powder binder that does work with epoxies. So, but for some reason here in the States, we don't have it, or it's very, very hard to get. Rarely can you find it with any of our distributors. So if you're overseas in Australia or the UK, you would just ask for an CSM with a powder binder if you're going to be working with epoxy. We made a little boo-boo on our cut right there. You can see I cut it a little too short, but for this application we're still going to be okay. I'm just going to wet it and blend it. That's the beautiful thing about CSM, is that it's real easy to blend it back onto itself. Makes for a very good cosmetic finish. So we moved on to the next phase, folks. Got our little fin roller, that's a little nylon one, and we're just systematically going from edge to the middle, and this will really help smooth things out. It'll work any little air bubbles out of the CSM, and it'll level out any little humps and bumps. We call that a bubble buster or a fin roller, but for something like this, it is really, really handy. Now sometimes the resin will get sticky on you when you're doing this, and you can actually take the fin roller and just get a little bit of acetone, just a little bit of acetone on it, and that'll keep the resin from sticking. So we've kind of gone from the middle out to the edges, and now I'm just going to kind of pull down from the corner to the bottom. It'll work out any little bubbles, and it'll smooth out any little humps and bumps. That's a great little tool to have in your arsenal. I kind of like the plastic ones or the nylon ones if you can find them. We use the aluminum ones too, but they tend to get real squeaky. I don't know why, but they're a little harder to keep clean, it seems like. Yep. Again, we're just going to start right over here in the middle. It's kind of a light hand. It's almost like when you're painting, you want to lift at the end. You don't want to gouge or push, especially on something like this. We want a super uniform, flat and true surface for our fillers and putties. The details are really where the quality work will come through. If you just take a few extra minutes and have a few simple tools to do it the right way, if you're careful with your lamination, you'll save yourself a lot of work on the fairing and shaping side of things, which is going to be the next phase. We've got a good foundation to work off of. I'm going to put a little bit of acetone on there. That'll kind of help the resin keep from sticking. We're going to be shaping this up. It's going to be just like kind of like doing body work, or almost like doing drywall or sheetrock work, finishing work. Some of you folks out there might do that kind of work if you have that skill set. If you've done some auto body or any drywall work, I guarantee you, you'll pick this up very naturally. And notice I'm not jumping all over the place either. It's kind of like we start at the back, work to the front, start at the front, work to the back. It's almost like you're doing a search pattern or grid. You don't want to miss any spots. I'll show you another trick here in a bit too. Y'all notice that the fiberglass is hanging down beyond the plywood just a bit, and that is okay. If we catch it just at the right moment, fiberglass kind of firms up, almost has like a firm jelly consistency, and you can take a razor knife and zip it off. That's going to be our next step. For our next trick, folks, going to need a good sharp razor knife, and you can see this resin has started to firm up. It's not rigid or crispy hard, but it's definitely firmed up. And you can just take this razor knife, you catch it at the right moment, save yourself an awful lot of sanding and grinding. and itchy. But there's a sweet spot for sure. If you wait too long, it won't cut well at all. And if you try to do it too early, it's gonna drag and pull, and you can kind of tell when you're trying to do it too early. It just won't cooperate. You can go around this so fast and easy though, compared to having to sand this, and it's gonna be very accurate as well. Yes. How nice does that look? That's one of those great little tricks, but you just got to catch it at the right moment. And obviously if the fiberglass is very, very thick, it can be a little trickier to do. But on something like this, that just saved us probably 30 minutes of sanding and grinding. All right, folks, we have reached the next phase. We have got full cure on our glass already. So about an hour, hour and a half, and I kicked the catalyst to it. So it went ahead and tacked off good enough for us to be able to come in here, and we trimmed it with a razor knife. And then I used some 40 grit paper on a block and just picked up a few of those edges and kind of knocked some of the burrs, and also just went over here and skimmed off anything. But man, if you look down there, that is beautiful and uniform and really, really nice. So what we're trying to do is set ourselves up to be in a good place for tomorrow when we come back. And so I went ahead and I mixed up another batch of the DC-PD blend. We went ahead and activated it pretty hot, closer to the 2% catalyst ratio. And we're gonna go ahead and fill in some of this roughness here. As nice as that glass work is, if you're gonna build a mold off of something, it's got to be very, very, very smooth and flat. So by putting a nice batch of resin on and letting it cure overnight, that's going to fill in some of those little ripples and between the hairs and the textures that you can see there. And that's going to require less fairing material tomorrow. And that's probably, it's going to kind of be a whole nother phase, which I guess technically you could say even putting this resin on here is part of the fairing process, because it's smoothing things out. What a difference. Now sometimes you can even do 2 or 3 coats like this and save on like some of your specialty primers you may think you may want to use. And we'll be getting into that a little bit too later on when we start fairing this thing out in probably the next episode. I want these episodes to be very detailed for you guys and gals, but also trying to keep them at a length that's consumable. If the videos are too long, sometimes a lot of folks don't know how that goes, but you folks out there that are regulars watching the channel, it's the view duration actually has a lot to do with how YouTube ranks our videos. And if you watch a higher percentage of the videos, they assume you must have enjoyed it and they'll recommend it to other folks. And the more the channel grows, or more it gets recommended, the more of these kind of videos we can do. Because I'm still not full-time with this yet. This is like we're trying to fit videos in because I enjoy it. I want to help you folks out there with your projects. I know I was just talking to one of my captain buddies, the cost of living and operating a business these days. And if you have a boat, being able to fix it on your own or build something like this versus having to hire someone to do it could save you a lot of money. But it takes us a lot of time and extra effort to document these videos. But I want y'all to know how much I appreciate everybody watching the channel. Now, that looks pretty darn good, but sometimes what you can do is after you rolled it, you can take a brush and you're just putting a little pass across the top. I don't know that we can see a real big difference in this particular piece, but they call that rolling and tipping. And if you'll notice, I'm coming in lightly and I'm lifting at the end of the pass there, but the roller gets it evenly distributed, and the brush sometimes will kind of smooth it down just a little bit more, give you a little nicer finish. You can even do that with top coat paints like All Grip, which we just did a video of that with my brother Mark on his big sailboat. If you don't have spray equipment, you can roll and tip. Yes. All right, folks. Well, that is a pretty good point to be at for the day. I think we're probably going to call this an episode. Again, I want to thank y'all so much for tuning in. It's Captain Joe here with Island Marine Charters, Fish Bump TV, my fantastic cameraman. And as always, we will catch you folks next time out.